We are now going live. We've got a number of people already joining us very promptly. Nice to see everybody checking in. My name is Sean Kelly from Sean Kelly Gallery. Good evening and thank you for joining us this evening for a wonderful conversation between Shahzia Sikander, Sadia Abbas and Ayad Akhtar. We're delighted that they are participating in this special event in anticipation of Shahzia's forthcoming exhibition, Weeping Willows, Liquid Tongues, which will take place at the gallery from November the 5th through December the 19th, 2020. Sadia Abbas is a novelist, scholar and professor at Rutgers University-Newark and at Simon Fraser University, British Columbia. In 2018, she published her novel, The Empty Room, and has most recently been working on Extraordinary Realities, an examination of Shahzia's work from 1987 to 2003, foregrounding Shahzia's critical role in bringing miniature painting into the contemporary canon. Ayad Akhtar is a Pulitzer Prize winning playwright, novelist and screenwriter. His latest novel, Homeland Elegies, was recently published to great critical acclaim. If you haven't read it, you must. Ayad is a trustee of PEN America and indeed will serve as its next president beginning in December 2020. Shahzia Sikander is internationally acknowledged as one of the most important artists of her generation. Her work takes classical Indo-Persian miniature painting as its point of departure from pre-modern beginnings to contemporary influences, and it's precisely that historical continuum and its continuous capacity for reinvention that has sparked Sikander's visually rich engagement in multiple media. Weeping Willows, Liquid Tongues will be her inaugural exhibition at the gallery and will feature the Artemet's intimate and large-scale drawings, a remarkable new single-channel video animation, luminous, intricate mosaics, and Shahzia's first ever freestanding sculpture. The panel will discuss Shahzia's forthcoming exhibition, Sadia's publication, Shahzia Sikander, Extraordinary Realities, and Ayad's ongoing dialogue with Shahzia and his new book, Homeland Elegies. We'll conclude the conversation with a brief Q&A section at the end of the conversation, which I hope you'll all submit questions for, which will be starting around 6:15. So, Sadia, can you discuss what led you to work on your forthcoming monograph on Shahzia, why you feel its publication is particularly important at this time, and share your thinking about how you conceptualized your approach to the book?
Thank you, Sean. It's a pleasure to be here. Hello, everyone, and hello, everyone out there in these baffling and increasingly painful times. Thank you for coming. I should be clear, it's not a monograph in the sense that I co-edited it with Jan Howard, who is the curator at the RISD Museum, and who has been wonderful about it, and it is a RISD publication. Shahzia and I have been in conversation for many years now, and I've been particularly struck by the later work. So part of what was interesting to me when Shahzia introduced me to Dennis Congdon, who's the head of painting at RISD and who admitted Shahzia, and I believe who was there when Julie Moretu and Kara Walker were admitted as well, was that we would get to talk about an important new scholarly intervention about Shahzia's work. And we'd get to bring in a whole bunch of really fascinating scholars. And Jan and Dennis were both extraordinarily open to it. So we have essays by Jan and myself, of course, but also Faisal Devji, who's a historian at Oxford, Gayatri Gopinath, who is at NYU, Kishore Rizvi, one of the great art historians of the moment, I think, also from Pakistan at Yale. And we also have conversations with Vasif Kurtun, the Turkish curator that Shahzia has been working with for, I think, 2 decades now, and Julie Moretu and Rick Lowe. The thing I'm proudest of in the book is, in fact, a conversation between Dennis Congdon and Bashir Ahmed, who was Shahzia's teacher in Lahore at the National College of Arts. And when I suggested the conversation to Jan and Dennis, they loved the idea, and Dennis, Shahzia, and I flew to Lahore to have the conversation in Bashir's studio. Now, why I love that moment in the development of the book is that it speaks very much to some of the concerns that we have right now as Americans, right? Immigrant Americans, but also Americans, and that is that America tends to talk about what it's given to its immigrants. It doesn't very often talk about what it's absorbed from them. And what Shahzia brought to RISD in the 1990s was an extraordinary training that predated her encounter with the United States, right? Not just her knowledge and not just her formation as a young Pakistani, and the kind of the social knowledge that comes with one's history, but in fact a very meticulous training. And that training, when it encountered what she did in the United States, produced this extraordinary, I think, explosion of work, which has just kind of gone from strength to strength. So part of what I was interested in when we had these intense conversations was to bring to the fore this, that very early in her work, starting with the scroll, which is her thesis exhibit, which kind of transformed miniature painting and gave birth to what we now know as the neo-miniature. She was exploring sort of all kinds of social and political issues, and gender and feminism obviously was one of them, but she was also always interested in questions of class, in questions of capital, in questions of social organization. And that work kind of continued to develop in explorations in her work in her engagement with company paintings from the colonial tradition and the East India Company. In Parallax, her extraordinary animation, which is about oil and the Middle East and capitalism. And so what we have is this astonishing artist who has been developing a visual idiom that comes from outside a rather Hegelian art history, but that at the same, who is being always read only through her identity as a Pakistani American or a Muslim American, but who's actually producing from within this different visual idiom and from within this different history an extraordinary meditation on colonial capitalism, right? And then also on America, because she does this wonderful Cooper Hewitt Museum piece on exhibition on, or piece, I'm not sure, I'm blurring on the details, she can tell you, but where she's taking on the Declaration of Independence. And she is, and then she just keeps developing, right? And that you're seeing in the current show as well, where there is this meditation on capitalism turns into a meditation on climate change as well, and its relation with, this culture of economic extraction, planetary violence, and ecocide, really. So I mean, what we wanted in the show, that's what you wanted in the show, what I wanted in the book, which I guess is a show of sorts, was to really kind of change the conversation and to think about these contributions outside the usual, Pakistani immigrant in the United States comes, hybridizes, and then hybridizes more, right? Which is completely boring. So we wanted to actually say that, these like hybrid bodies and their hybrid work actually do very interesting thinking. And what is that thinking, right? So that's how the book was conceptualized. And, I had wonderful partners in Jan Howd and Dennis Congdon, and then Shahzia was always there, right? Just to talk things through with. And it's been extraordinary, right? And enriching. I'm going to wrap up by just then talking more about this, the hybrid bodies, hybridizing, and getting beyond it in the relationship between, I think, Shahzia's work and Ayad's work. because I think that this collaboration, and I mean this ongoing collaboration between the two of them, into which I have now inserted myself, is marks an extraordinary moment in post-colonial, let's say, history, right? But I'm a post-colonialist, so I have to throw in the word for what it's worth. That's what I study. But we've had a conversation about diaspora, right? A South Asian diaspora for going on 40 years now, right? Since Rushdie and Hanif Qureshi in Britain. This particular conjunction between two Pakistani Americans in the post 9/11 moment, right, is almost unprecedented. I think it's unprecedented. I can't think of precursors of the same, to this conversation. And I think what's so interesting about both Ayad's work, and I'm speaking specifically about Homeland Elegies now, and I'm going to confess that I don't know the other work very well, because I read things when they have to do with work, when it's contemporary, right? But this collaboration, right, is astonishing, because Shahzia has this trajectory that she's been mapping in her work, and in an idiom that is Indo-Persian, but also abstract, that is multimedia, that has to do with time and temporality as a whole, but also scale, very much so from the beginning. But it's repeatedly taken on issues of class, but also capitalism, as I said. Homeland Elegies, which I just had the pleasure of reading, and it kind of blew my mind. I picked it up with, and I have to confess, with a certain kind of professorial, and we're arrogant as academic types, skepticism. And then I opened the book and I read the first 2 pages and I couldn't put it down. And I can't remember the last time that happened to me, right? And it's just that kind of opening, the prelude, I think it is, to the novel called, I think it's called America, Am I Right, Ayad? Right, which just blew me away, right? Everything, the Whitman references, but also the sheer kind of fluent skepticism of it all, right? Which was also just so utterly in love with language. And so I just wanted, and I've been in love with language, otherwise, why else would I do this? And I just couldn't put it down. But what was so incredible about it was that it was not the usual immigrant narrative either, right? That it had the story of migration, but it completely reinvented the genre, it seemed to me. It wasn't about redeeming America through the immigrant or redeeming the immigrant through America, which seemed to me two of the poles of the hyphenation. It was not about that at all, and it was this incredible meditation, right, on a crisis of capitalism manifested in America, right? So it becomes this deconstruction of the American dream, where dream acquires, and the word dream acquires all kinds of psychoanalytic, but also philosophically multivalent meanings. But it's also sort of an extraordinary meditation on debt as an index of that capitalism, right? And the way in which America is defined increasingly by debt. And of course, part of what I find interesting about this also, right, is that at this historical moment, this meditation on debt, and now I'm going to take it in a different metaphorical direction, is also, I think, demanding that America think about its own debt to people, right? And it's a debt that's been completely erased, right? In this absorption, we all get this story, and especially us women, right? And Muslim women and brown women and so on, who are immigrants, right? We freed you, right? Or we set you free. And I'm like, dude, I just came to a different kind of misogyny. Let's not get too excited here, But
Sadia, at this point,
I think I'm going to give it to Ayad.
Yeah. Ayad, do you want to say something, or should I show some images?
No, why don't you show some images? I mean, I was rapt by Sadia.
I know, me too. But we have such
but somebody has to interrupt me too. So.
Short time window.
Yeah,
no, I was done. That was literally, that was going to be the segue. Yeah, go for it. But I thought that Ayad should talk about debt too.
Yes, I think Ayad, we would love to hear something from you.
Thank you, Sadia. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Shahzia. It's an honor to be here. I'm excited to see some of your work, and then let's talk a little bit about some stuff around some of the images that you've made and that has brought us here today.
Okay. All right. So this is the book that Sadia was mentioning. And I'm going to jump right into the work, some of the works that are here. But also, I think I would like to acknowledge here how important Sadia's examination of my work has been in opening up lots of conversations around capitalism, imperialism, like giving, you know, a language in how it can be framed, especially to myself, because I've already been sharing Sadia's essay from the book, excerpts out of the essay, you know, with many people. And that language has, you can see that language sort of emerging in terms of how this work is being framed. So I'm going to use a quotation out of Sadia's essay here. Perhaps nowhere is the paradox of the culture of extraction more concentrated than in the Christmas tree. The image is Sikander's rendition of a machine of the same name used to extract oil. There are perhaps few more fitting symbols for colonial and imperial ideology than Sikander's Christmas tree, promising beneficent, redemptive gifts while being an engine of extraction, and the violence and immiseration of the planet that has attended the economy of oil in the past few decades. So this Christmas tree motif, I have mentioned it before, it came to me when I was doing research and in UAE, and this was like a British petroleum magazine from 1962, an issue out of that. And the photograph in it, when I saw, I wasn't aware that oil rigs were called Christmas trees. So I thought I created the title to ingenious English wit, a comment on the gift-bearing sentiment of the oil rigs. So inspired to create the tree out of the valves, spools, knobs, using chains as garlands. But the image for me was less about the direct reference to the discovery of oil, but more about capturing the transformative potential of an image and its laden meaning. So, for example, here, if I can show this, the image shatters and reformulates itself into new iterations, emphasizing, for me, economic and global interconnections. This is from the animation Parallax. The drips that are occurring also on the surface of these very large works, you know, they are more or less like 8 to 9 feet in height. They offer a rendition of oil dripping, pooling at the bottom. So the trees here express the paradox of the culture of extraction, the toxic byproducts, the accidental spillage in oceans. It's also about the land, soil / burn agriculture, all of the situations, human acts that create havoc on aquatic ecosystems. And with that, you know, with that in mind, I wanted to create an animation also that played with this idea of displacement and pollution, and also how economic ecological conditions are actually a mirror of social conditions, whether it's the erosion of climate, of borders, of the rising waters, of rising heat, of displacement of bodies, of war. And this particular work, Reckoning, the upheaval that is embodied in the uprooted tree, is for me about transcendental homelessness of the modern era and the sort of lurking threat of the possible eco-catastrophe, as well as the capacity to use the inner turmoil from dark to light, from, you know, life to death, from this notion of imagination. And that's often a theme that I have spoken to Ayad about, but here in this, you will see that these particle systems also for me reflect dust, light, a testament to the numinous nature that can either sustain or extinguish human life. So the moving, morphing, flowering land emphasizes that the earth is not an inert entity where the invisible and the visible world are both animated through the presence of life and death. And with that, I'm going to read an excerpt from one of the plaques that Ayad wrote for my work at the Princeton, which is like a 3-storied, 70-foot work in glass, talking about the metaphorical to the real. He says, the cavernous interior of the depicted figure's human torso is exposed at the site of a rich and nascent renewal. From the depth of the delimited, the simply personal, this depicted figure finds rebirth, inspiration into realms of greater vibrancy and possibility. Here, creation is seen as a profound act of imagination, one that unites the artist not only with tradition, but with tradition's embodiments of the numinous itself. So this work, this is a work, when I was doing this work, we were in conversation about many topics that I think that covered our collaborative work, which dealt with the motif of mirage, but also I think Ayad was writing junk at that time. So I will come back to that, but I wanted to mention another particular very signature image in my work, and another excerpt from one of the short pieces he wrote. The fertile golden figure shimmers and dances, brightening the glance of the viewer. The references are manifold. The Jewish Shekinah or Sakina in Quranic parlance, the feminine complement to the masculine divine, the chthonic mother goddesses of Sikandar's native soil along the Indus, Matisse's exalted dancers. Under the aegis of the metaphor of prophet as the one who seeks, Sikandar offers her own bold, joyous, inclusive, artistic gesture. She incorporates pagan, artistic, Indian, and Islamic inspirations. It is a dance of traditions embodied and anchoring this triptych depicting a cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. Artistic creation is a dance dancing the world. So talking, you know, about the feminine and in particular women in power, I'm going to shift to the sculpture, which is also going to be in this exhibition at Sean Kelly Gallery, Promiscuous Intimacies. This work actually has a relationship to the language, which is already in my work, in particular, a work that I'd done, Malign Monsters. At that time, you know, it wasn't important for me to declare the content through a 3-dimensional form. I was just culling art history's classicism and ethnocentric reactions to Indian art, as per Winckelmann's doctrine. So I was also making a point by entangling mannerism as another outsider aesthetic to the classical canon. But when I was on the commission for a New York City Mayoral Advisory Commission of City Art and Monuments in 2017. At that time, I had I was going through the process of hearing different public opinions, studying the monuments and the complicated histories, historical reckoning, tensions between communities regarding representation. And at that time, I decided that because of this overt male representation, I was going to do something feminine based and also an anti-monument. And to do that, like worked with dancers, and I wanted to make sure that the posture that I was going after was actually possible. So the piece was made in clay, and the sculpture, you know, also refers to Gayatri Gopinath's essay in the book, and its entanglement of the Greco-Roman Venus and the Indian Devata, in Gayatri's words, explores the promiscuous intimacies of multiple times, spaces, art historical traditions, bodies, desires, and subjectivities. In their suggestive embrace, the intertwined female bodies bear the symbolic weight of communal identities from across multiple temporal and geographic terrains. They evoke non-heteronormative desires that are often cast as foreign and inauthentic, and instead challenge the viewer to imagine a different present and future. So sort of the sculpture with its backward glance demands that we understand tradition, culture, identity, etc., as impure, heterogeneous, unstable, and always in process. And, you know, I was also inspired by other art historians like Sarah Bond, and about how classical statuary was polychromatic. And so I've been painting it with patina. And that brings me to another favorite work, which is a cover. Sadia chose it as the cover for the RISD book. And in here, I just wanted to point out that though this work I was doing in 2000, but then my show at the Asia Society was canceled because of September 11th or postponed. So I had the work back again, and I inserted some more imagery in it. So it's sort of it's a very timely work right at the point of 9/11. But I am again going to read something Gayatri wrote, that indeed the painting's representation of gendered bodies takes on a particular valence in the context of imperial war and carnage at the start of Bush's war on terror. It is worth recalling that the initial human rights justification for the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001 was to, quote unquote, save Muslim women from Islamic extremism. Pleasure Pillar speaks back to such paternalistic and fetishizing gendered discourses and insists on revivifying submerged and forgotten narratives, genealogies, and traditions of pleasurable, sensuous, and joyous gendered embodiments, which is here just to, just to share this. But that brings me to, Ayad, if you want to talk right here, it's fine, but I just want to show a couple of portraits that, I did, which led to my continuing making portraits out of your new book. And here, when I first reached out to him, it was basically on this topic of Miraj, the tradition of prophets' alleged miraculous journey into the celestial realms. And I was always interested in how to find a way to take ownership of that history, because it's always so complex in terms of its imagination and depiction in Islamic lands and in the West, but it exists in the historical tradition of miniature painting. So how to engage with it? And I think that's how I reached out to you. And it was something that you were already working on, because at that time I didn't know that you had even written that play, The Who and the What. And this is part of that project. And then I think all of this is happening simultaneously. This led me to, kind of how to use this idea and incorporate the extension motif in the Princeton mosaic, with the hope to sort of inject a visceral, powerful experience. Another piece that I did is also a protagonist out of your play, Zarina. And then that brings me to a series of portraits, which are ranging from right here, Robert Bork, to your parents, the character of the mother, the protagonist of the mother, and my sort of expansion, my sort of a version of that. And then this relationship of father and son that unfolds through your book, it gave me sort of another lens into the generational dynamic between the immigrant parents and their first generation children, and how that sort of tension I wanted to capture in the work. And some of this already engages with some of the works I was doing. So I think the work Merchant of Death, which is titled after your chapter, but it also engages with how I was using in the context of economics building at Princeton, the idea of Adam Smith sort of in East India Company attire with lofty ideas and wings, but sort of stuck and unable to fly so this sort of tension between representation of that in that context. And I think we were talking at that time about this work. So a lot of those ideas, you were such a sort of a, I was able to discuss these simultaneously. And I think when you look at some of these images of the new portraits that I've done, which are fairly large, they for me, sort of, you know, they are thoroughly American, as you said. But yet they are informed by a very specific engagement with the miniature tradition. And for that, I think the book opens up so many ways, and it's a work in progress. I think this relationship that I have with all of these topics, I think this idea of the hyphenate reality and the archetypal iconographies is also embodied in this painting, which led to the mosaic. And then the idea of the mosaic is coming from the notion of the pixel from the digital work. So this sort of build up, like, you know, where the unit of the mosaic is almost like a character, or the relationship between text and image. That's kind of how I see also how my interest in languages, often it emerges in my use of titles in my work. So these, I think I will end here so that we have time to.
Add?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are we back?
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, I was again wrapped by the images and just sort of, you know, luxuriating. I'll just say a few words and then we can get into a conversation. But you know, when I first came to New York in the mid '90s, and then, you know, shortly thereafter, your work started to appear, and I was so, you know, sort of stunned by what you were doing, and you know, as a Pakistani American, just as a kid of Pakistani parents, you know, not ever having, I mean, I read Rushdie but there was not all that much to sort of like to experience in the sort of realm of really world-class art making and world-class art. And the strength of those early images just felt both familiar and I don't know, it was inspiring. You were very inspiring. I think you were inspiring to a whole generation of us young Pakistani, you know, American artists. And then I got a, you know, flash forward to, I don't know what it was, 15 years later or whatever. And I get an email from you out of the blue saying, you know, would you want to talk about some collaboration? I was like, wait, is this the same Shahzia Sikander? I was like, really? The same person? So we started this conversation, you know, it's about 5 or 6 years ago. That's become sometimes almost a daily conversation. We're talking quite a bit about different things. You're showing me your work, I'm showing you my work. And there's been this kind of blending of preoccupations. And I want to speak, you know, obviously some of the themes are things that we are both interested in, but I think beneath the themes is there's another level, is something that Sadia is getting to earlier on when she was talking about a kind of a new experience that we're both negotiating. You know, that you're negotiating in one way because of your history, I'm negotiating in another way because of my history. And what we share is that we're negotiating it in craft, that we're looking to craft to find a way to resolve these questions, or not even resolve them, but entertain them. How do we entertain these questions as deeply as possible through craft? I admire your craft so much, and it's your relentless pursuit of strength in the image, that you're looking for a source of strength, irrespective of thematic. You know, you may get there by whether it's capitalism or whether it's whatever modality that you're looking for. Ultimately, there's a strength that is that begins to appear in your best work that I am inspired by, and that inspires me to try to do the same. So obviously, more specifically speaking, in terms of theme, we've discussed quite a bit the iconography of the Prophet and what the Prophet can mean to us as, I don't know, what kind of Muslims are we, right? I mean, we're in some liminal category of Muslim. So many of our family members would not take us seriously as Muslims, right? So, but Islam still represents a kind of source of inspiration for us, and in what ways and how, and that ongoing question of the Prophet as an example of a seer, of someone who has seen something others don't, who has brought something to the world that others didn't know. That immersion in the interior, that loss of self to a process of the unconscious, all of that is stuff that we've been talking about for quite some time, and that you've found amazing ways to sort of embody, you know. And obviously, you know, when you read some of the stuff I wrote about, you're like, wow, that's pretty good. I can't, you inspired some real, you know, you inspired some good stuff out of me. It's not always that good. So anyway, so that's just some anecdotal stuff that I wanted to share in commentary, you know, very inspired by these images that you just shared, and very inspired by Sadia's introductory remarks. So thanks.
Sadia?
I love the way Shahzia does this every time. There's a lull in the conversation. First she says, shut up, then she says, come back in. Well, you know, it's lovely that we're also inspired by each other. We really are. But I also want to pick up on something that Ayad said that speaks to the images that Shahzia was showing, right? Which is a question of craft, right? And I'm really glad that you brought that up, because, you know, my graduate student the other day was my teaching assistant. We were reading Louis Erdrich in my undergraduate class, and we were reading Dear John Wayne, and there's this great moment in that poem where Erdrich is exploring the nature of the American we, right? And there's a great play on the collective personal pronoun. And she said something lovely. She said, you know, entertain the complication to the students, because I was trying to get the students to see that there wasn't one answer to what Erdrich was trying to do with the very fragmented we of the American collective self, right? And especially for a Native American who has inherited that violence and is privy to those narratives that are being crafted over the Native body, right, and the Western part of them. So it's a beautiful poem, and so, but that entertainment of the complication, right, which is what neither you nor Shahzia ever give up on. Right. And I think that does have to do with both of your passions for craft, right? What is so beautiful about Homeland Elegies, or what is so wonderful about it? You know, beautiful is the wrong word for it. It's such a kind of assertive book in all kinds of ways, and its wit, and in its breadth, and in its refusal to apologize at any level, right? But it has to do with the power of language, right? And the power of language as something that you have every right to as an immigrant, right? Right. It's not a language into which you will sidle, and through which you will apologize. It's a language that you will take assertively and, you know, make it do things. It's a big book in that sense. And I think that's, and that passion for language, that passion for the sentence and for wit, is also something that you see in Shahzia's work at the level of visual, but also at the level of the linguistic, right? Which is that the titles are always witty and fun, and she won't let, as she's told me before, sorry, I'm talking about you in the third person here, but let the painting leave the studio until it has the right name, right? And but it's also that devotion to craft, right? That where there's a moment at which you just simply surrender to the craft itself and let it take you where it goes. And it's kind of really interesting to watch Shahzia in public conversations, right? Because people keep trying to make her talk about other things, and she's like, but the craft, you know, this kind of like this sort of valiant and desperate attempt to get people to talk about the work.
Right, because that's what it is. You know, like we're sitting at a desk where she's at the, you know, she's in Munich with the glass makers and the mosaic makers. Hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours of precise know-how to be able to match color, effect, meaning, and then to let the subconscious to have enough craft that you allow and you can trust things to happen by themselves. And in my case, that's taken, you know, 30 years of practice. You know, I wish I could have, I was telling, you know, somebody today that I feel like the book I just wrote is a book I wished I had written, I'd wanted to write since I was 18 years old. But I had to learn and live so much before I had the ability to sort of put all of that stuff together in a way that it was natural, that it was organic. And I think that's the thing that with Shazia's work, I think about those portraits that she's doing from the book. And when we had been having this conversation about there's a fiction, nonfiction, there's some characters who are kind of composites and others who are clearly drawn from the historical record, like Robert Bork and all of that sort of stuff. And I was fascinated by this idea that she was talking about of a portrait that could kind of capture the fact that this is a concoction because it's drawn, but it's substantially drawn from a reality. And so that paradox of the fiction, nonfiction could be embodied visually so perfectly in a drawing. And then she showed me these drawings and they were so exquisite. It was almost like an Ingres, like the Jean-Dominique Ingres portraits, pencil drawings. And it was also something uniquely syncretic about it. There was not identifiably South Asian in her technique, but there was something about her rendering of Robert Bork that sort of collapsed South Asian representation iconography with America. It was fascinating. It sort of gave birth to the very idiom of the book itself. But just to get back to this issue of craft, it's the dedication, hour after hour after hour after day after day after day after month and year after year, that really creates the possibility for that power and that strength that I find inspiring. And it's the thing that we spend a lot of time sort of talking about.
Shahzia?
Yeah.
Right back at you.
No, absolutely. I think it has been incredibly generative for me to have these conversations with both of you, and also to have found both of you. I think that's been really wonderful, because as at many levels I have expressed that, been wanting to find ways of engaging with the nuance that is in the work. And this was a great opportunity to work on Extraordinary Realities book, to kind of look backward with new scholarship, with ways that the work had not yet, been ever written about. And in that process, myself having, this kind of going backward to move forward, the example being the sculptural work. So I find like these cyclical ways of thinking and making are very much part of this idea of inherently sort of knowing your craft, and then it just surfaces in different ways. And that's how I think in terms of working in a range of interdisciplinary range of languages, where I can bring all of it together through the thinking process, which happens through drawing. And then the drawing allows me to collaborate with writing, or with music, with a composer, with an author, with singers, or with poets, or with movement, with animation, and now sculpture. So I don't see that they are separate, but at the same time, I think I'm very aware and I respect the autonomy that is, that the other person or the other point of view is going to bring to the collaborative engagement. And I find ways on how it can be seamless and how it can still create that type of friction and seamlessness simultaneously. And I think that's how I felt when I saw your plays, Ayad. Like I remember, like especially all of them, but definitely Junk. It was so informative. Like I learned so much about it, but the dialogue was so precise and distilled that it kind of went through you, and you thought of it, and then at the same time you were learning something new. But it was obviously, I think a lot of your work focuses so much on the experience of the viewer. Yeah. And so that's how I've always thought of how I think of my work, is that it has to have a visceral experience. Right. It is, after all, I'm playing with a material, with a language that requires the viewer to step into it. And once the viewer is in it, then there are many ways of entering the work. And that's how for me, like drawing parallels with Ayad's work was at times incredibly abstract, and at times really alarmingly familiar. And that's what I thought was so exciting, is that to find somebody who is doing things in so many similar ways. Like even our early discussions on dreams, for example, I did not know that, you know, so much of your work is about dreams. And then I was always shy about sharing a lot of that because I thought, you know, it was, I wasn't sure if I should share it or not.
Were you shy about that? Because I couldn't tell.
No, like not to you, but I meant like
she hides it well.
I know.
She hides it well.
I know.
But I think that sort of ability to sort of share, even in
Sure.
terms of the process that
Sure.
goes behind, in terms of like how you come up with iconographies.
Sadia, I have a question I want to ask you. You know, it seems to me in sort of thinking through all of this together, just as we are, you know, obviously Shahzia and I share a lot of history, but we also have very different histories. But in a way, I wonder, you know, there's such a relentless pursuit of dwelling in the craft, both in her work and in mine.
Sure.
I mean, it's almost like it's the only, like we don't have, or I don't have a home other than the craft. Like that's the home I'm building in a way. And I wonder if there is some sort of like, I don't know, immigrant text to that. If there is some quality of looking for belonging in a practice rather than in a place. I mean, it might be a half-baked idea, but it's just occurring to me now that perhaps there is some historical or cultural dimension to that. Do you have any thoughts about that? I mean, does that make sense to you? Or
That makes so much sense to me. That's how I think. I think like your work is your house. Like you're thinking.
In a way, yeah.
Yeah, I think it does. And I actually think it makes sense both at the experiential level. I always have thoughts, but anyway, just kidding, but you know, but also at the level of the historical, right? So you said something about being Muslims and the Prophet's life and so on, right? But there are two things. For me at least, and you know, Shahzia and I are the same generation, and you know, I produced much later because language actually I think takes a different kind of time also, right? Because it's not, you've got to have the instinct, but you've also got to unfold it in language in a very different way, and also because I was just tormented and weird. But there's also something else, right? Which is that. For instance, for me, and this made its way into my novel as well, it's also about dwelling with the craft even of both scholarship and fiction writing. It's dwelling with the craft of the sentence. And it is my home. There's no getting around it. I love writing, right? And I mean, it's painful and it's exhausting, you know what it's like, but at the same time, you know, I'm a bear when I'm not doing it. So part of it is, yes, finding a home, right? And so I can take it everywhere with me, right? And it's always there. As long as I have that equipment, I'm good. Right. But I think that it's also in the fact that, and I think this is, I don't know how it gets inflicted once you grow up here, but for Shahzia and I who grew up in Pakistan, even though in two very, very different cities, Karachi and Lahore, there is a way in which there's a certain kind of element, and I want to be careful. I'm going to use the word ritual, but I don't want it to get turned into something bland about tradition versus modernity, right? I mean, that's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is there are habits of being that are still very much in play in South Asia, right? That are much less ruptured than they are here, right? Right. And it can be anything. It can be the fact that you mix your own henna to do your hair. I don't know, right? It can be the fact that, and this is very, very, very much on my mind right now because there was just a huge rally in Karachi against Shias, but I was raised as a Shia. And for Shia, you know, and it makes its way into the novel as well, there are all of these practices that construct your sociality, right? Which are very habitual, right? And language becomes habitual because there's so much narration, so much poetry, and so much your body, even in the act of flagellation, right? And I don't mean the whips and the knives. I don't mean the knives. I mean just the kind of the keeping tune with the poetry of martyrdom, right? Where your body becomes a percussive instrument, right? So over and over again, there's so much craft in daily life, and so much collective and communal craft in daily life, right? So of course, in the West, that becomes a kind of primitivism, right? That gets projected back on us, right? That we're the primitives who are still in touch with a ruptured modernity, right? But of course, we're modern too, right? But our modernity hasn't been ruptured in this way. So we've got to figure out what that means. And you've got to look at various communities within the United States. So to me, yes, craft is about dwelling, right? And yes, it's about producing a dwelling for your work, for yourself in the work, right? But I think it's something we carry with us because of the kind of structures that have been transmitted to us as well, right? And Shahzia and I really connect on that because we'll crack up and crack these silly jokes, and we only became friends through the work about 8 years ago, right? But it became so quickly bonded because we could speak that language and understand it. But I've seen her valiantly flailing, right, and saying desperately the craft, and people just looking at her, no, Pakistan won't talk, you know, and it's just so exhausting. Yeah. But anyway, but it's a joy to be here.
Done. You guys, this could go on all night. It's so fascinating, and I feel so outside this conversation. It's such a fabulous conversation, and you're almost talking an interior language with each other. It's really fascinating to listen to.
Does it translate?
No.
Okay, just checking.
I want to open it. I want to open it up to the audience. If we got some questions, if you have questions, there's a Q&A toggle at the bottom of the screen. Please submit them via that. I do have a question that I'm going to come to in a second, but I just want to pick up on something and ask you all to reflect upon this. I mean, I think the conversation about craft that you've all spoken to is so fascinating in Shahzia's work. But for me, one of the things that's truly extraordinary is the way in which Shahzia has been able to take that very formal training and the craft of that training and just blow it up through so many different media and through so many different scale, at the same time retaining the intense language and the intensity of the object, as she has gone from the miniature tradition to all-enveloping room-sized installations or mosaics that flow architecturally between floors in buildings. I mean, I just think that what she's been able to do in terms of extending that craft out into the world across so many media, video, mosaic, painting, at the same time, where the intensity of the craft has been retained, is completely unique. And I wonder if you guys could talk a little bit about how you feel about that.
Well, I think that's spot on. I mean, it's such a, yeah, and I don't know, it's so true what you're saying about her work and the ability to sort of arrest the viewer in so many different forms, and to arrest the viewer with a kind of absorptive strength in so many different forms, and each of those forms requiring a different form of absorptive strength on display in order to do that. And so the toggling between forms of craft, no, it's astonishing. I mean, I don't know, I can't speak to what it is that she's doing, but I just want to signal that that's, yeah, I think that is particularly unique and worth discussing. I agree. Shahzia, or Sadia, what do you guys think about that?
Well, if Shahzia wants to go, she's, yeah.
No, I'm happy to hear what you have to say.
Well, I mean, it's just such a big scene.
It's obvious, like, you know, I shared a selection of work, so of course, like,
yeah, no,
the idea of craft is not literal, for sure. I approach my work.
Yeah.
And you know, and I think it's really important to leave a certain amount of mystery in the work, and I feel I'm engaging already with so much precision. Like the language I use is so precise that it has to be balanced with an open-endedness, as well as some level of information that remains how I see it, how I want to create a work that's timeless, how their work can remain relevant, you know, in every sort of cyclical, generational ways. Those are the things that I think very deeply about. And the processes are several. There's research, there's reading, there's letting things simmer, coming to them later, letting sometimes things that can't be solved, I let dreams help me through that process. So it's very investigative. It's also about engaging the archives, which already is a very truncated space. So when that's a very conscious way of trying to link through stories, through histories, sponge narratives, narratives that haven't yet surfaced because they haven't even been archived. And a lot of the language in the work is symbolic of that too, whether it's the kind of that black space in the animations, the void. These are things that, you know, in my mind have a certain reason for being what they are. So the iconography is intuitive, but it's also worked at. But the way I work at it, I don't want to labor it. I still want it to be fluid. So I think that's what I try to aim for, is to have precision and fluidity operate at the same time.
I have a question from the audience specifically for Sadia. Sadia, you made reference when you were speaking to the idea of debt. Could you expand upon that, and perhaps, Ayad, if you've got any input into that part of the conversation as well?
Could I follow up first on what they were just saying and then link it back up?
Sure.
Well, first, I want to say that I do think that Shahzia's work in that sense is, and the question that you asked, Sean, and that Ayad was expanding on, is unique. I mean, and I think you got it spot on, that it's the convergence of that extraordinary attention to craft with this absolute expansiveness, right, of thinking, and then of invention, like this multiple reinvention, right, that was constantly happening, which I think is there in the earliest work. And I do think it's there with the scroll. So I think that there is something quite distinct about it. And I think part of that distinction has to also do with something that one experiences a lot with Shahzia, right? Which is, and you know, in talking, right? Which is, you know, I'll try to say something and then somebody's just like, you can't pin it down, right? I mean, she doesn't want to be pinned down, which is, and that's great, right? Because that's about a certain intrinsic restlessness, because there's so much coming into the work, right? There's so much at play, right? And then one day she's saying one thing, and then I'm like, wait a minute, you just said that. And I have this like amazing memory for things that people say to me. I wish I didn't. So I was like, well, wait a minute, you were saying you couldn't do this two weeks ago, right? And suddenly it's there. And like everything gets absorbed, and absorptive is the word that Ayad is using. But then it gets turned into this extraordinary explosion of you know, where it's almost as if the initial draw to the miniature was precisely that its entire kind of almost ontological paradox was scale, right? And that paradox has continued to, because it's so small and it does so much, right? And exploding that paradox has been so much of the work, right? From in these large, extraordinary animations as well. The question of debt, I was saying it in two ways. One of which is, and I think Ayad can speak to it better, that Ayad has an amazing meditation on the problematic of debt for Americans, right? In Homeland Elegies, which is or the conditioned indebtedness, right? Because and where, you know, to be American at this point in history, unless you're super wealthy, is to be in debt, right? And how that functions in relation to the American dream, which Ayad has also said in the Nation article that he, in the conversation that Shahzia and Ayad had, is that, you know, a lot of people also come here, especially, you know, certain middle-class immigrants like Pakistanis were in the 50s and 60s, when you got this large influx of Pakistani Americans, is to make money, right? That's also part of and money without shame, I think, is the phrase that Ayad used. So part of the American lure, right, isn't just freedom or freedom at all. It's actually money, you know, freedom through money. And so the paradox of the American condition, of course, is that money is now increasingly, especially in neoliberal times, unavailable to most. And so the novel becomes this extraordinary exploration of the Trump era, right? but it actually is talking about things that precede the Trump era, right? It's about the larger conditions of capitalism and in its current, I'm sorry, I keep coming back to it thematically, but and we're living through a particular instantiation. I was turning the question of debt into another direction. I've been writing about it in my academic book as well, which is the complete, the question of debt in countries like Greece and Pakistan right now, in the third world, in Latin America, as we used to talk about it in the 90s, which is the way in which the first world, such as it is, and there's nothing, whatever first means in this context, is has turned debt into the condition of the rest of the planet. And of course, that again, given the language that Shahzia and I have shared about extraction, is kind of extraordinary, because even as the first world is utterly indebted to its extraction over centuries from those enslaved parts of the planet, the dance is, right, that other people are made to feel that they're the indebted ones. And that's something that gets replicated in the question of the immigrants as well. You're so lucky we gave you this. But but then people even say that to the descendants of slaves, that, it was so good that when they're justifying it, that, that we liberated you by bringing you here as slaves, that, I think somebody once called it, when Michelle Obama made her statement about the White House, I don't know who it was who said that it was the Ritz-Carlton of slave plantations. Right? I don't know if there was. So what I'm saying is, right, that the erasure of debt, of our own debt, in the metropole, such as it is, and in the colonial centers, and the ascription of debt to others is part of what constitutes the West at this point, whatever the West is.
Very much so. Ayad, I'm going to direct this question to you initially, okay. And anybody can chip in as well. The question is, within each of your individual practices, you discuss themes of family, colonialism, socio-political issues, etc. When sharing your work with the public, how much do you expect the audience to come with an existing knowledge of these issues?
Right.
And to follow up on that, how do you find the interpretation different from viewing or reading in the US versus other countries?
Yes, the answer the first. Thank you for that, Sean, and whoever asked the question. I think it's the big challenge, really. Both Shahzia and I share, to some extent, is that we're working from cultural reference that a lot of the folks who we're making work and sharing it with don't have. They don't have those references. They don't understand certain rudiments of Islamic mythology or whatever it may be that we're riffing off of or that we're playing with. They'll understand certain references that are more native to them. So for example, if I'm drawing on Whitman or Emerson or whatever, that they'll know those references, but they won't know the other ones. And so then it becomes a dance. It becomes a, I quote Horace quite a bit, the Roman poet, the purpose of art is to delight and instruct. And part of the instruction becomes figuring out ways to get the necessary information into it without losing the delight. Like those two things have to coexist. So it's a good question. As far as folks reading the work, I think with this particular book, what I would say is that Americans really get it. And then some non-Americans don't get it and some do. So I think it's a book that was written out of this American moment for a certain American experience, because of a certain American experience. And I think that, I think non-American Pakistanis will have a certain experience of this book, which is, I hope, a worthwhile one. But there may be dimensions of the American saga and a critique of the American experience, some of the things that Sadia is talking about with regards to debt as they pertain to the American experience, that might be lost in the translation. So,
right. Well, so I've got a question here which I'd like to direct towards Shahzia first, and each of you as creative people, please pick up on it if you'd like to. I think it's a rather wonderful question. So this person says, hello, my name is Siddharth Thupil. I'm an artist from Princeton, New Jersey, currently pursuing a BFA at RISD. As a first generation South Asian American artist, a lot of my work revolves around balancing vernacular traditions with global reference. What would you describe as a moment or experience that helped you learn how to bridge those two identities as one into one homogeneous one? Shahzia, could you respond to that?
So my whole thing was that I never wanted to play on the dichotomy. It was about exploding the binaries. So I never really felt like I was after a multicultural or this amalgam homogenous notion of bringing different things into a mix. And for me, I think what I can share from my experience is that how difference can coexist, and how I play with the idea of difference is that, for example, just one of the iconographies that I've used where I've removed the body of the female but kept her head silhouette. So that sort of icon is incredibly rigid. But when I multiply it and choreograph it into millions of little particle systems, it really transforms from its rigidity to something fluid and liquid. And that type of dynamic is how I tend to solve this issue, is that keep the difference in play and yet find ways to move the story or the meaning of laden images, forward in fresh ways.
Sean, can I just say one thing about that?
Sure.
Which is that, as a playwright, as a dramatic artist or whatever, the audience has been really helpful for me. And so, when you write a joke, the audience has to laugh. So whatever your intention is, it doesn't really matter, drawing from this or drawing from that, and I want to put these things together and I want to make that work, but it doesn't work unless the audience laughs. And so in a weird way, there's something about and maybe, I've been very inspired by the sort of Jewish American tradition of writers and comics and some way in which that work has been a template for me to understand how to find a way into the so-called mainstream, even though, that's not exactly where I sit, but nevertheless, to keep that notion of a mainstream as a kind of guiding star, that jokes have to make people laugh. So it's a different way of responding to the question, maybe with just a sort of sense of perspective of, 3 decades of trying to figure out that exact question that young person has. So
that's great. Well, and lovely that you've both come at it from such different perspectives with such commonality of vision. So guys, I want to thank you so much. I mean, we've been on for well over an hour. We could keep going. I know we've had a very, very active audience and they've stayed with us, which is testament to how brilliant you've all been. I really cannot wait for Sadia's extraordinary realities, which I'm sure is going to be an extraordinary book, an examination of Shahzia's work that has been evolving for so long through this conversation. We've been fortunate enough to see some of the works, many of the works that Shahzia has prepared for the exhibition over the last few years. And I know it's going to be an absolutely incredible exhibition. It opens, Weeping Willows, Liquid Tongues, opens at the gallery on November the 5th and runs through virtually the end of the year through December the 19th. We're very excited about that. There's an enormous amount of advanced press and interest in the exhibition already building up. New York Times, Vogue, it's coming at us from all different directions. 9 years in the making. It's going to be a remarkable show. And finally, Ayad, I cannot stress enough, if you have not picked up Ayad's book, it is the book of the season. You have to read it. It's brilliant. It's been receiving extraordinary press. And we're very, very proud at Penn that Ayad is going to be leading us in the next years to come as president of Penn America. Thank you all so much for participating and really being such a brilliant panel and so insightful. It's been totally fascinating. I wish we had another 6 or 7 hours. We could fill it very happily. Sadia, Shahzia, Ayad, thank you so much. It's really been a treat.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.